I'll never forget the moment my husband stood up at our anniversary dinner, wine glass in hand, and told my father he should be grateful. Grateful that a man like him had married me. That single sentence ended a 7-year marriage and started a reckoning he never saw coming. If you've ever felt disrespected in your own home, if you've ever been told to be quiet and keep the peace, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about what happens when a family finally says, enough is enough. This is my story, and I'm sharing it so you know you're never powerless, no matter who you're up against. They say love is blind, and I believed that for a long time, maybe too long. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what does matter is that I'm a corporate lawyer who built her career from the ground up. I graduated top of my class, made partner at 32, and never needed anyone's money to define my worth. But somehow I still ended up married to a man who thought his last name was worth more than my entire existence. I met him at a charity gala 8 years ago. He was charming, confident, and came from what people call old money. His family made their fortune in petroleum, generations of wealth that they wore like armor. He seemed different from the others in that room, though. He actually listened when I spoke about criminal justice reform. He laughed at my jokes. He looked at me like I was the only person in the world. I thought I'd found someone who saw me for who I really was. We got engaged within a year. Fast, I know, but when you're in your 30s and everyone's asking when you're going to settle down, it felt right. The warning signs were there from the beginning. Subtle things I told myself didn't matter. The way his mother's smile never quite reached her eyes when she hugged me. How his father would introduce me as the lawyer, but never by my name. The questions about where I grew up, what my parents did, always with this tone like they were collecting evidence. But my husband would squeeze my hand and whisper that they just needed time, that they weren't used to change. I believed him because I wanted to, because I loved him, or maybe because I'd already invested so much in the idea of us that walking away felt like admitting defeat. The first time his mother commented on my hair, we'd been married 3 months. I'd worn it natural to a family brunch, and she touched it without asking, saying it was so interesting, so different. She asked if I'd ever considered straightening it permanently, for a more polished look. My husband said nothing. When I brought it up later in the car, he sighed and said she was from a different generation, that I was being too sensitive. That became his favorite phrase over the years, too sensitive. It's how he dismissed every microaggression, every backhanded compliment, every racist comment disguised as concern. When his uncle asked if our future children would have my features or his, hoping they'd lean more toward his side, I was too sensitive. When I was excluded from business dinners because they were family only, even though I was family, I was too sensitive. When his parents talked about bloodlines and legacy like they were discussing horse breeding, you guessed it, too sensitive. My family saw it all. My father is a retired judge, a man who spent 40 years fighting for justice in a system designed to break people who look like us. My mother is a university professor who's published 6 books on African American literature and history. My brother works as a financial analyst, and my sister is an investigative journalist. They're not people who can be dismissed or underestimated, but my husband's family tried anyway. I remember the first time both families met, 2 months before the wedding. My parents brought homemade food, stories, warmth. His parents brought wine that cost more than my parents' mortgage payment, and opinions about everything. The conversation was painful. Every question his family asked mine felt like a test they were designed to fail. What neighborhood did they live in? Which schools did their children attend? The subtext was deafening. After that dinner, my mother held my hand and asked if I was sure about this marriage. Not because she didn't want me to be happy, but because she'd seen this story before. She'd watched brilliant black women marry into white families who would never truly accept them, who would spend decades making them prove their worth. I told her it would be different, that love was enough. She just nodded, but I saw the worry in her eyes. The years passed, and the disrespect became routine. At Christmas dinners, my accomplishments were polite footnotes, while my husband's mediocre business deals were celebrated like Nobel Prize achievements. He worked for his father's company, a position handed to him at birth, yet somehow I was the one who needed to prove I belonged in professional spaces. His family would ask about my cases, then interrupt to talk about their golf games. I became very good at smiling through gritted teeth. My own family stopped attending their events after the third year. My father said he'd rather spend holidays with people who respected him, and I couldn't blame him. But it created this divide in my life. I'd spend Christmas morning with my family, then drive 2 hours to spend the evening with his, pretending everything was fine. My husband never questioned why my family stayed away. Part of me thinks he preferred it that way. The breaking point started building months before our 7th anniversary. His mother had started making comments about grandchildren, specifically about how she hoped any babies would have his features, his coloring. She showed me pictures of him as a child, like she was presenting a genetic blueprint I should aim for. When I mentioned wanting our children to embrace both cultures, she smiled that cold smile and said some cultures were more suited for certain environments than others. I told my husband that night that I couldn't do this anymore, that his family's racism wasn't subtle, and his silence was making him complicit. We had the biggest fight of our marriage. He accused me of trying to divide him from his family, of being ungrateful for everything they'd done for us. I asked what exactly they'd done for us besides make me feel small. He didn't have an answer, just anger that I dare question them. Then came the anniversary announcement. He told me we'd be celebrating at his family's estate with both families in attendance. Not asked, told. I said I wanted something intimate, just us, maybe a weekend away where we could actually talk about our marriage. He dismissed it immediately. Family tradition mattered, he said. This was important. I had a sick feeling in my stomach, but I agreed because I always agreed. I called my parents to invite them, and the silence on the other end of the phone told me everything. My father finally spoke. He asked if I was sure I wanted them there, if I was ready for what might happen. I didn't understand what he meant. He just said they'd come, but I should be prepared. My mother got on the phone and told me she loved me, that no matter what happened, I was never alone. I should have pressed them for details, but part of me didn't want to know. The night of our anniversary arrived with the kind of spring weather that makes everything look deceptively beautiful. The estate was decorated like a magazine spread, all white flowers and golden light. Both families arrived within minutes of each other, and the contrast was stark. My family brought warmth and genuine smiles. His family brought expectations and judgment. Dinner started normally enough, polite conversation about weather and current events, nothing controversial. I sat between both worlds, trying to bridge an uncrossable gap. My husband drank more wine than usual, and his father kept refilling his glass. That should have been another warning sign. Then his father made a comment about property values, about how certain neighborhoods were declining because of the changing demographic. My father's jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. My husband laughed, actually laughed at his father's thinly veiled racism. My brother started to say something, but my sister touched his arm, shook her head slightly. They were waiting for something. His mother joined in, talking about bloodlines and heritage, about how important it was to preserve certain legacies. She looked directly at me when she said some families had centuries of breeding and culture that shouldn't be diluted. The word diluted hung in the air like poison. My mother's hand found mine under the table, squeezed it once. That's when my husband stood up. His face was flushed from wine and something darker, something that had been building for years. He raised his glass and said he wanted to make a toast. To patience, he said. To being patient with people who didn't understand the sacrifices required to maintain a certain standard of living. Then he turned to my father and said it. He said my father should be grateful that a man from his background had married me, that my family had been living well because of his generosity, enjoying a lifestyle they could never afford on their own. that maybe it was time everyone acknowledged what this marriage had really done for me, for all of us. The silence that followed was crushing. I felt like I couldn't breathe. 7 years of swallowing disrespect, of defending him, of believing he loved me despite his family. And this was who he really was. This was what he actually thought. My father stood up slowly. He's not a tall man, but in that moment, he seemed to tower over everyone. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder, placed it carefully on the table. His voice when he spoke was calm, steady, the same voice he'd used for 40 years on the bench. He said he'd been documenting everything for the past 6 years. Every racist comment, every microaggression, every incident. Photographs, recordings from public spaces, witnesses willing to testify to the pattern of discrimination. He slid the folder toward my husband, told him to open it. Inside were bank statements. My husband had been hiding money in a separate account, over $2 million he'd moved from our joint assets. Money from my cases, my bonuses, my inheritance from my grandmother, all quietly transferred while he complained about me being too sensitive. But my father wasn't done. He mentioned the 3 affairs my husband had during business trips, named the women, had the hotel receipts, the phone records. My mother had hired a private investigator 2 years ago after I'd called her crying one too many times. They'd been building a case, waiting for the right moment. My brother stood next, pulled out his own folder. As a financial analyst, he'd spent months tracing my husband's company dealings, fraud, environmental violations, payoffs to inspectors, all documented, all ready to be turned over to authorities. My sister smiled, said her newspaper had been sitting on the story for a year, waiting for my signal. One word from me and his family's reputation would be destroyed by morning. The look on my husband's face was something I'll never forget. Pure shock, followed by fear, followed by rage. He tried to bluster, to threaten, but my father cut him off. 2 choices, he said. A clean divorce with a fair split of assets and no drama, or public exposure, legal warfare, and the complete destruction of everything his family had built. His parents, who'd been so smug moments before, suddenly looked terrified. They knew my family wasn't bluffing. They knew they'd underestimated us, dismissed us as unsophisticated people they could push around. And now they realized their mistake. I stood up, my hands surprisingly steady. I removed my wedding ring and placed it on the table next to the folders. I looked at my husband and told him I'd been trying to save our marriage for 7 years, while he'd been trying to prove I wasn't worthy of it. I was done proving anything to anyone. We left that night, my family and me, walked out of that mansion into the cool spring air. I cried the whole drive home, not because I was losing him, but because I was finally free. My mother held me while my father made phone calls to his lawyer friends. My siblings sat with me through the night, reminding me that I'd never been alone. I just hadn't realized my army had been standing behind me all along. The divorce took 6 months. He chose option 1, knew he couldn't win a public battle. I got everything I was entitled to, plus damages for the hidden assets and emotional distress. His family never contacted me again, and honestly, the silence was a gift. I heard later that his parents made him go to therapy, not to become a better person, but to learn how to hide his racism better for the next woman. I'm telling you this story because I need you to understand something. Your worth is not determined by who loves you or who accepts you. My family never said I told you so. They never made me feel stupid for believing in a man who didn't deserve my faith. They just loved me, supported me, and when the time came, they fought for me. If you're in a situation where you're constantly made to feel less than, where you're told you're too sensitive or asking for too much, listen to that voice inside you that knows better. Document everything. Build your case. Surround yourself with people who see your value. And when someone finally crosses that line you've been defending for too long, let the people who really love you have the final word. If this story reminded you that you're never alone when you have real family behind you, smash that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me, Have you ever had to stand up to someone who thought their money made them untouchable? Have you ever watched someone underestimate the quiet strength of people they dismissed? Your story matters, and I want to hear it. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their worth today. See you in the next one, and remember, dignity and documentation beat arrogance every single time.